Let's look at how to do and work out percentages when we're not allowed to use a calculator. So, first of all, we need to understand the building blocks that we're going to use to do this with. And in order to do that, we need to understand the equivalencies between these common percentages and fractions. So, 50% is a half. And we find a half of something by dividing by 2. Now 25% is half of 50% or a quarter, whichever one you prefer. So it's either a quarter, or you can think of it as being half of 50%. So you would halve and half again to get your 25%. 10% is equivalent to 1/10 as a fraction, so we find it by dividing by 10. 5% is half of 10%, so you find your 10% first and then you half it, divide it by 2 to get your 5%. And then our final building block here is 1%, and that is equal to 1/100th as a fraction. So that means to find it, we're going to divide by 100. Okay, so now let's look at how we use these building blocks. So for example, if I wanted to find 75%, 75% is the same as 50% plus 25%. So I'd halve first of all the number that I've got to get the 50%, then I'd halve it again to get the 25%, and then I would add the two parts together. Now let's look at 30%. So how would I do that using these building blocks? I would find out what 10% is, and then I would multiply the answer by 3 to get 30%. For 95%, what we're going to do is we'll start with our 100%, which is just your original number, and we're going to take off 5%. Now remember, to get that 5%, I'd have to work out the 10% first by dividing by 10, and then halve it to get 5%. And then one more example here. So if I want to do 48%, I could work out 50% to start with, and then take away 2 lots of 1%. If you really prefer, you could do 4 lots of 10%, a 5%, and 3 1%, but I think you can see that that's got more steps and stages to it. So we're always looking for the shortest possible route to get there. So sometimes it's adding them together, sometimes it's multiplying, and sometimes it's even taking away. So I'm now going to do a couple of examples so that you can see how this all works. So let's say we've been asked to find 35% of 250. So first of all, let's write down and work out what our strategy is going to be. So 35% is going to be 3 lots of 10% plus 5%. So now all I need to do is work out my building blocks, my 10% and my 5%. So 10% of 250 we get by dividing this by 10, so that's going to give us 25. And then 5% equals half of the 10%. So it's half of the 25, so that's going to give us 12.5. So now we need to go back to our strategy. So what do I need to do? I need 3 lots of 10%, so that's 3 lots of 25, which gives me 75. and I need to add on 5%. So I need to add on the 12.5 there. So if we add that on, you can see that we end up with 87.5 as our answer. So 35% of 250 is 87.5. Now, if we'd actually been asked to increase 250 by 15%, for example, we're going to need to do an extra step at the end. So our initial strategy is to work out the 15%. So 15% is the same as 10% plus 5%. Now I'm not going to work those out again because we've already done them up here. So we're simply going to add them. So we've got our 25, which is our 10%, and our 12.5, which is our 5%. If we add them together, we're going to get 37.5. But we've got one last thing to do here because it said increase by 15%. So now we need to add that on to our original amount. So that's going to give us 287.5. If they'd said decrease it by 15%, then instead of adding, we would simply take away. So don't forget your borrowing. 10 take away 5, 9 take away 7, 4 take away 3, and the 2 on its own like that. So that's how we do percentages without a calculator.